Thomas Edison, born 1847, died 1931. Follow along with me in your American Experience book, beginning on page 221. Opportunity is missed by most people because it is dressed in overalls and looks like work. Quoted by John L. Mason in An Enemy Called Average, 1990. Thomas Edison's entire life revolved around invention, discovery, and hard work. As a child, he read voraciously, sold newspapers, and conducted chemistry experiments in the baggage car of a train. During this period of life, he both saved a little girl from being hit by a train and accidentally started a fire in a train. Later, he worked for the Associated Press, developed a quick way to tally legislative votes, and invented a stock ticker, all before his 25th birthday. A true businessman, grown-up Thomas invented left and right, selling his creations to the highest bidder. He made lots of partnerships with other inventors and even worked with Henry Ford. Thomas invented the battery for the Model T. And Nikola Tesla. Although Thomas did not invent the very first light bulb, his version was cheap and efficient enough for regular people to buy. By the time Thomas died at the age of 84, he had over 1,000 patents and had added to his list of inventions the phonograph, taximeter, and the kinetograph, the camera used to film movies. Thomas's inventions helped kickstart an age of industry and economic boom. Who knows how different the world of technology might have been without him? The following excerpt is from The Boyhood of Great Inventors by A. Fraser Robertson, chapter Thomas Alva Edison. To see as a boy the greatest inventor of the age, we shall have to cross the Atlantic and take a journey to the United States of America. England has done wonders in the way of discovery and invention, but it is to New England, as we call it, because she is a daughter of the old mother country, that we must go for a brightness and sharpness of wit that sometimes makes us think of the flash of polished steel. We all know the name of Edison. It is not a name of history, for he is living today, a man still in his prime, still sending out from that wonderful brain of his things that astonish men and have won for him the name of the wonder worker of the modern world. I have before me as I write the picture of a square brick house with outside shutters hooked back, a white paling half encircling it, and a couple of bare, leafless trees before it. The house is plain and poor and has strangely unfamiliar look to our English eyes, but it is of the deepest interest to us as the birthplace of Thomas Edison. The boy first saw the light in 1847, and though he came into the world with but a poor provision waiting him, he found himself welcomed with a very wealth of love and tenderness. Mrs. Edison had Scotch blood in her veins, and she was a mother in 1,000. It is a common thing in history to find that a son draws his greatness, many of his best qualities, from his mother, and this son took many of his from Mrs. Edison. She was his constant companion, his loving nurse, his gentle teacher during those early years of life that leave so deep an impression on the afterwards. The child was 7 years old when the Edison family moved to a place called Port Huron, and there he began to spend every spare moment in reading. So earnest was he that he set himself to read through the Detroit Free Library and had devoured a close row of volumes before his attempt was discovered. Strange and solemn sound some of the titles of the books he read when he was 12 years old, a time when most boys are lightly dipping into newspapers and magazines and books of adventure. Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy, Hume's History of England, Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. In 1862, when he was barely 15 years old, he came out more fully from the shelter of home and mixed with the busy world, making a place in it for himself by his own young wits. He was a newspaper boy and sold his papers like other boys, not stopping still in one place, but going on the train to different stations along the line and selling as he went. About this time, there was a great fever and ferment in America. The North were fighting with the South, and people panted for news of each battle as it took place. Papers with reports were devoured as soon as printed. Now, thought Edison, is my chance. And there began to work in the brain of the boy a big scheme. As the first step to carrying it out, he betook himself to the station telegraph clerk. "If," he said, "you will let me wire the war news on a few stations ahead and have it written up on the blackboard, "I will promise you some papers, and now and then a magazine." He repeated his request to the different clerks along the line. His eager face and twinkling eyes and earnest words won all hearts, and his request was granted. He next went to the editor of a well-known paper. "Give me 1,000 copies," he begged, "and I will pay out of the proceeds of my venture." Here again he succeeded, and now it remained but to get the engine driver to promise him a few minutes at the different stations, and he started on his venture. At the first stopping place, he had been wont to sell some half-dozen papers. That day, as he looked out, the platform was strangely crowded, and it suddenly dawned on him from the eager faces of the public and their excited gestures that it was the papers they wanted. He dashed onto the platform, and in a few minutes had sold 40 at 5 cents each, or about a penny of our money. It was much the same at the next station. The people had read the headings on the station blackboard, and they crowded onto the platform, an excited, hustling mob, for papers. It dawned on the boy here was a chance to raise his prices. So he doubled them and sold 150 where he used to sell a dozen. It was the same all along the line. At the last station, Port Huron, his home, the people were most excited of all. The town was a mile from the station. Edison started off with his papers, but was met halfway by an eager, hurrying crowd. They all wanted news. He stopped, drawing up in front of a church where a prayer meeting was being held. Presently the people poured out and surrounded the boy, willing to pay him 5 times the usual price of his paper. He began to take in, as he expressed it, in his own terse, telling words, a young fortune. After this, the busy boyish brain began to look eagerly ahead, to face life seriously. He did not start off on a fresh track. He took hold of what was nearest to his hand, and he bent his mind on improving that. He had found people were in a hurry for news. The quicker they got it, the better they were pleased. Nothing could surely be quicker than that they should get it damp from the press. So it flashed into his brain, why not print a paper on the train? The question was no sooner asked than answered. He looked about till he lighted on an old car, and he rigged it up as a printing office with old types and stereos he begged from a newspaper office. In this novel press room, he threw off sheet after sheet of what he called the Grand Trunk Herald, the first and last paper ever printed on a train. The boy of 15 was editor, compositor, and news vendor in one. The paper caught on, and the circulation went up to 400. But, alas, misfortune was soon to overwhelm the young adventurer. One unlucky day, the printing office, the old car, which grew daily more decrepit and unequal to the jolting journey, by a more violent lurch than usual, threw over a bottle of phosphorus. The cork flew out, and in a few seconds the car was in flames. They were easily enough got under, but Edison's venture had received its death blow. The furious car conductor would henceforth have none of him. He boxed his ears and pitched him onto the platform along with his precious belongings, the whole paraphernalia of his craft. It is a sorry picture that presents itself to our mind's eye, the boy standing half-stunned, the rubbish and debris of his belongings strewn at his feet, and the cherished old jolting car, the scene of his labors, gradually fading into distance. It seemed as if his bright dreams were all extinguished, his golden hopes doomed to come to nothing. As he stood there, he faced it all, a mere boy low down in the world, badly fed, poorly clothed, almost penniless. But we do not hear that he either flinched or complained, or that a boyish sob rose in his throat. He was made of the stuff of the stoic. It is our hearts that are sore and anguished, not chiefly for the hopes and dreams disappointed, but because of a terrible calamity that befell him then, when he was perhaps hardly conscious of it, but that grew darker and weightier as the years rolled on. When the irritated conductor had boxed the boy's ears, so brutal had been his onslaught that the delicate nerves were injured for life. And now with the flight of years has come deafness to wrap the great inventor in a partial mantle of silence. It is perhaps we who feel most the infinite pathos of the thing, while the man himself bears his affliction with the same noble patience with which he accepts disappointment long years ago as a boy. At that time, he straightway turned his eyes bravely homewards. He picked up his precious belongings and carried them to a cellar in his father's house. It was about this time that his mind began to bend toward that which has ever been held for him a keen interest throughout life, the telegraph. A waking ambition in him desired strongly to perfect himself in it. He was poor and friendless, and yet firmly, doggedly resolved to get on somehow. So out of his scant earnings, still as a newsboy, he bought a book on telegraphy, and this he pored over night and day. And now at this early age, I think the great inventor must have touched that mind that was afterwards to yield him so wondrously of its wealth. The boyish mind was putting out feelers, groping at first in the direction of creation, that divine faculty that is granted to so few of us. We can recognize the seed in its first tiny sproutings. He and a boy friend resolved to make a telegraph. They made a line of wire between their houses, insulated with bottles, and crossed under a busy thoroughfare by means of an old cable found in the bed of the Detroit River. The first magnets were wound with wire and swathed in ancient rags, and a piece of spring brass formed the key. Edison pressed two large and formidable-looking cats into his service, tied a wire to their legs, and applied friction to their backs. But the experiment ended in failure. The cats, frightened and furious, resented the liberty and parted company with the wire, dashing off in different directions. But failure never discouraged Edison, nor stayed the working of his brain. He was a true philosopher, and he was, like an elastic ball, possessed of enormous rebound. Handed down to us, there is a story of the boy which, while it may not throw much light on his brain, throws some on his heart and on his ready courage. He was still a newspaper boy on the trains, and while at most stations a few minutes was the limit of waiting, at a certain station where shunting took place, the minutes ran to half an hour. The boy was wont to spend this half hour with the station master's child, of whom he was fond, or to loiter about his garden. On this particular day, the engine driver had unlinked the cars in a siding, and one was being sent with a good deal of impetus to join the other portion. It came on steadily, no one on it to control it, and right in its path was the unconscious baby smiling in the morning sunshine. Not a moment was to be lost. Edison threw down his papers and his hat on the platform and dashed to the rescue, and not a second too soon. As he threw himself and the child free of the line, the car passed and struck his heel. The two fell with such violence on the gravel beyond that the stone particles were driven into their flesh, but they were safe. The grateful father was at a loss how he could show his gratitude to the rescuer of his child. He had little money and no reward to give. At last a plan occurred to him. "I will teach you telegraphing," he said to the boy, "and prepare you for the position of night operator at not less than $25 a month." Edison was delighted. The bargain was struck. The wage seemed, no doubt, a small fortune to the boy, rather more than 5 of our English pounds. And now he had got his toe on the tape, his foot on the ladder, if it were only on the lowest round. In 3 months he could teach his master, and the promised situation was got for him. From that he passed on to other situations, and gradually he began to make his mark. He had a mind wonderfully quick to see a difficult situation and to deal with it. There is a story told of how one winter a severe frost had coated the great river between Port Huron and Sarnia, how the cable was broken, and people could neither get news nor send it to the opposite bank of the river. The spot was crowded with people, baffled and vexed. Edison came along with a brain rarely at fault and faced the thing. Suddenly, to the onlookers' astonishment, he mounted a locomotive and sent a piercing whistle across the water, imitating, by the toots of the engine, the dots and dashes of the telegraph system. In this way, he shouted, "Hola, Sarnia! Sarnia, do you get what I say?" At first, there was silence on the part of the telegraph man across the water. The people on the bank were breathless with excitement. At last, the reply came, clear and thrilling. The man on the other side had understood, and the two cities could talk again to each other. After this, people began to hear of Edison's fame, but the mania for experiments had seized him. The cut-and-dry, monotonous routine of work seemed flat and stale to him by comparison. It was as if an enchanted region of fairyland had been opened to the boy. To be allowed to revel in it, he denied himself food and necessary sleep. When he was 17 years old, he invented a telegraph instrument that would transfer writing from one line to another without the help of an operator. There were no want of openings now for him to choose from, but sometimes doors, after they had been opened, were rudely shut again through envy and evil feeling. In the great world of invention and discovery, there are perhaps more ups and downs than in any other. Some of Edison's fellow workers were kind and generous. Others were jealous and detracting. One manager did him an ill turn. He was unequal to completing a discovery he had begun. On the thing being showed to him, Edison immediately saw a light and brought it to completion. But jealousy crept into the man's small mind, and he dismissed the boy on a false charge. So at 17, he was thrown again on the world. Money was still scarce. Books and instruments and calls from home swallowed up the most of it. The boy was chafing under ill treatment and a sense of injustice. The want of sleep, perhaps of proper food, was telling on him. But he looked forward with a clear, undaunted eye. He wanted to reach a certain town where he believed work awaited him. It meant a walk of 100 miles. He was weak, disheartened, ill-prepared for it, but he did it. He arrived footsore and weary, with torn shoes and tattered clothes, and his worldly possessions tied in a handkerchief on his back. In this shabby plight, he presented himself at the telegraph office. He was eyed coldly enough at first, but by and by, when tests were given, he stood the tests. There was that in the eager eyes and underneath the shabby clothes that could not but make itself felt as a power. He began work. At first, his fellow clerks laughed at him. In time, they were won over, and later he stood out as a workman of the first order. He began to collect about him materials for printing, machinery without which he never felt quite happy. He did a clever thing one day in the office that brought him into notice. He took a press report at one sitting, a sitting that lasted from 3:30 p.m. until 4:30 a.m., After that, he carefully divided it into paragraphs so that each printer would have exactly 3 lines to print, and so that a column could be set up in 2 or 3 minutes. It may be that about this time money was rather more plentiful, for Edison began to go to second-hand bookshops, and so to gratify his deep-seated thirst for knowledge. His kindness of heart was well known, and there were many about only too ready to take advantage of it. There were telegraphists who roamed the country in time of war, tramp operators they were called, who took short engagements and generally ended their time with a spree. These found out Edison, a man who did not drink himself and a man who might be persuaded to lend them money, and these were his worst enemies. One day he bought at an auction 50 volumes of the North American Review. Half a dozen men were sponging off him in his rooms when he brought home the books and ranged them unsuspiciously round his walls. Directly he had gone out, his guests helped themselves to his purchase, landed them at the nearest pawnbrokers, and drank the money they brought. But his love for experiments sometimes brought him into scrapes and disaster, as when he moved a bottle of sulfuric acid one day, strictly against rules, and the bottle spilt, the contents eating through the floor of the manager's room below, and there eating up his floor and carpet, the unlucky accident bringing Edison his dismissal. And now, at the age of 21, after many different situations and different experiences, Edison turned his steps to Boston. His open-handedness had left him short of money. As was often the case with him, he was sailing very close to the wind. His dress was poor and shabby, and 4 days, nights traveling had not improved his appearance. When he presented himself at the office where he was to be taken on, the other clerks ridiculed him as a jay from the woolly West. They made up their minds to play a practical joke on him. They took the New York telegraph man into their confidence. It was arranged he should send a dispatch, which Edison was to receive. By this time, Edison had so perfected himself in receiving messages that he could write from 46 to 54 words a minute, quicker than any other operator in the United States. Not knowing this man, the sender began slowly, then quickened his pace. So did Edison. Quicker still he worked. Edison was in no way discomfited. Soon the New York man had reached his highest speed, to which Edison responded with ease, cool, collected, and stopping now and then to sharpen a pencil between. By this time he had discovered that the others were trying to get a rise out of him, but he went on steadily with his work. Then he stopped and spoke quietly to the New York man. "Say, young man," he said, in his dry, humorous way, "change off and send with your other foot." But the New York man had reached the end of his tether and had to get someone else to finish, and so Edison won his laurels, and the Jay from the woolly West was regarded ever after with enormous respect. After that, his place was in the front rank. Now he had reached the threshold of manhood, and a long, dazzling vista of achievement and success stretched before him had he known it. About this time, a great, strong conviction of his responsibilities and of the opportunities life held out to him swept over him. "Adams," he said to a friend, "I've got so much to do, and life is so short that I'm going to hustle." And if we try to look at what he has crowded into a life not long, we must allow that he has indeed hustled to some purpose. As we briefly glance at the bent of his manhood, his doings fairly dazzle us. He read enormously all sorts of works on telegraphy and electricity, and he produced from his brain that which makes him the greatest inventor of the age. If we tried to enumerate his inventions, the names alone would fill pages. We can do little more than name a few. Among the first of these was how to send 4 messages at the same time over one telegraph wire. But even after he had embarked on the glorious sea of discovery, what ups and downs, what seesaws of fortune were in store for him. Hunger at times, torn clothes, and battered shoes. But from depths and half drowning up again, he always came to the surface. He rose grandly, relying on his own indomitable will. About this time good fortune befell him. For inventing some telegraphic appliances, he got $50,000, or rather more than £10,000. He could hardly believe his good luck, and it was with this he immediately rigged up for himself a workshop. And now he was rapidly rising, and the field before him was gradually opening up wider and wider. He started a laboratory at a place called Newark, and from this time onwards, his inventions seemed to flow from his brain in a well-nigh continuous stream. His workmen were devoted to his service. His genial good humor and kindliness, the absence of all harshness in his manner, and his love of fun could not but endear him to them. They caught the infection, too, of his earnestness. When he had an idea in his brain, he worked at it, as it were, red hot, almost without rest or cessation, and they were rarely reluctant to help him. "Now, you fellows," he would say, shutting himself and his workmen up in a room on the top flat, "I've locked the door, and you'll have to stay here until this job is completed." During 60 hours, perhaps, he would take no sleep and little food, while his brain would work at highest pressure until the thing was wrought. Then he would relax and sleep for as long as 36 hours at a stretch. And now his fame had spread far and wide. The people at Menlo Park, to which he removed, some 24 miles from New York, began to look upon him as a wizard, a man possessing magical powers. It seemed to them there was nothing he could not do. Exaggerated tales of his wonderful powers spread all over the country. "If people track me here," he said, he had been besieged at Newark, "I shall simply have to take to the woods." Child after child was the offspring of the inventor's brain. At one time, within the space of a few years, as many as 45 were born. There was the microphone, which is much like the telephone, except that in the microphone the sound is magnified. There was the megaphone, which brings faraway sounds near, so that cattle crunching grass 6 miles off could be heard distinctly at Menlo Park. There was the kintoscope, we all know, which by swiftly passing pictures, as many as 46 a second, seems to give us a single person in motion, somewhat on the lines of that toy of our childhood, the wheel of life. And there was the grand king of inventions, the phonograph, that overtops all the rest. We know it, all of us, by this time. We have listened to it with the tubes at our ears while the voice of someone speaking at a distance is distinctly borne to us, or the strains of a song sung by some great singer. In 1888, Edison sent his first phonogram by steamer to England. His friend here had only to take out the wax cylinder, put it into his machine, and set it in motion, and lo! It seemed to him as if Edison himself were in the room talking to him. Great men all over the world recorded their astonishment and their praises of this wonderful invention. The Queen sent him a message of congratulation. People flocked to every exhibition to see it. to the French, one from countries all over Europe. They saw it and straightway went into raptures. Edison himself, looking into the future, seemed to see volumes it might yet be brought to do. It might be used to write letters merely from dictation. It might be used to make clocks speak, to tell when it was time to come to meals. It might be used for toys. A tiny phonograph might be placed inside a doll, and it would straightway talk, or in a toy animal, it would grunt and growl. What a strange thing that in this world of passing away and change we would be able to preserve from destruction such treasures sheltered in a wax cylinder, some great man's words of wisdom, or the silver tones of a sweet musician. The more Edison's brain accomplished, the more it did seem able to do. As a man, he showed himself untiring as when a boy. He went on discovering. He invented a way of telegraphing from a moving train. He invented an electric railroad that drew delighted thousands at the Chicago exhibition. In 1879, his attention turned to lighting, and he bent all his energies on inventing an incandescent lamp for electric light. He spent days working at a sort of white heat. He began on the 16th of October, but mishaps and accidents seemed to threaten his invention. "Let us," he cried to his partner in a ferment of excitement, "let us make a lamp before we sleep or die in the attempt." On the morning of the 21st, it was done. It astonished the world. It opened up possibilities for miners and divers and for men everywhere. On the occasion of its exhibition, people flocked from all parts of the United States. Special trains were run. The same furor over the marvel reigned at the Paris exhibition and at every other exhibition, and through it all, a fame, a popularity enough to turn the head of most mortals, the man remained the same, modest, simple, unpretentious. From Menlo Park, he went to Orange. His laboratory there was fitted up with everything conceivable that an inventor red-hot and eager might want at a moment's notice. And yet often the workrooms presented the strangest appearance of disorder. Workmen sometimes stretched on benches or on floor after a heavy strain, the great master himself thrown down, a stick under his head, a coat wound around it for a pillow, and so snatching a short interval of sleep. He would not be interrupted by visitors. In this great world of his own, he seems at times to live a sort of separate existence. We are amazed, dazzled, astonished by the tremendous results one man in his lifetime has achieved. He has not been content to take something and modify it and improve it and set it to a new purpose, as men whom we call inventors have done in all ages. But he seems to have called upon the very forces of nature to do his bidding. It is almost as if he had harnessed the winds, the air, the sound, electricity for his purposes. A man, after a single discovery, not seldom rests on his laurels for life. This man is still in his prime, and we cannot tell yet what product of his brain will still astonish us, and we cannot touch here on a tithe of what he has done. He lives sometimes in his northern home in New Jersey, sometimes at Orange. As a man, he shows the same genial, kindly sympathy which, as a boy, never failed to win the hearts of his fellow clerks, the same modesty that disarmed their jealousy. These things chain his workmen to him today with links of love. Now that men praise and laud him all over the world, he shows the same good-natured indifference to name and fame that he has shown all through. And he has lost nothing of the tireless energy that used to support him through hard work and long night sittings as a boy. This man who, as someone has said it, has kept the path to the patent office red hot with his footsteps, this wonder worker of the modern world. Notes and important vocabulary. Note 1 on page 222. Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla was a Serbian-American scientist who worked with electricity and magnetic fields, worthy of further research. Note 2. Tassimeter, a machine used to measure the tiny temperature changes, helpful in measuring infrared radiation. Note 3 on page 223. Paling. Paling is a fence of pointed posts. Note 4 on page 224. Port Huron, a city in Michigan. Note 5. Ferment, frenzied excitement. Note 6 on page 225 refers to the conversion of pennies and money, as this story was printed in a book in England. Note 7 on page 226, decrepit. Decrepit means old and weak. Note 8, he boxed his ears. That means he hit him on the sides of his head. Note 9, paraphernalia. Paraphernalia is accessories or equipment needed for a certain activity. Note 10, debris. Debris is fragmented trash or wreckage. Note 11 on page 227, stoic. Stoicism is an ancient philosophy that believes there is serenity in being free from passion. Note 12, pathos. Pathos is one of 3 Greek words used to describe ways of persuasion. Pathos is an appeal to emotion. Logos is an appeal to reason or logic, and ethos is an appeal to authority. Note 13 on page 228, shunting. Shunting is the pushing or pulling of a train or train cars from one track to another. Note 14 on page 229, Sarnia. Sarnia is a city in Ontario, Canada. Note 15 on page 230, there were no want of openings. Here, no want refers to lack. There were no lack of openings. Note 16 on page 233, laurels. In ancient Greece, winners of the Olympics were crowned with a laurel wreath, a headband of leaves. You've probably seen this on statues or in paintings. Now it's used as a term to connote success. Note 17 on page 234, indomitable, impossible to defeat. Note 18, Newark. Newark is a city in New Jersey. Note 19 on page 235, besiege means surrounded and attacked, overwhelmed with requests, or harassed.